Hey everybody, this is Rabbit. Welcome to the channel, and today we're going to be discussing the survivability onion and how it applies to the Battletech miniatures game. Obviously, there are a lot of factors that go into survivability, and the goal of this video is to look at the different factors and how you can properly weight each one to understand how durable a mech truly is. Obvious questions first, what exactly is a survivability onion? In military circles, a survivability onion is a way you can evaluate the steps you can take to not get destroyed by the enemy, and it starts with the outer layers going all the way to the inner layers, with the layers gradually getting more dangerous to both the loss of vehicle and the loss of crew as you go further and further in. In effect, the closer you get to the middle, the more desperate you are. The outermost layer of a survivability onion is essentially don't be there. Simple enough, the enemy can't kill you if you are not there. Now, in reference to Battletech, this could most easily be likened to simply staying outside of range of the enemy weapons. The problem with staying outside of the range of enemy weapons is the only way to guarantee this is to also not be within range of your own weapons. There are going to be situations where your weapons may outrange the enemy, and this is a viable option. However, this ends up being a fairly situational option in most areas. This is effectively board state neutral. That is to say, you aren't dealing damage, but you also aren't taking damage either. On top of that, it's probably one of the least reliable parts of the survivability onion to employ, because there's no way to guarantee your opponent doesn't essentially have the same weapons you do, and even if you are employing this aspect and your opponent doesn't have those weapons, they may also have light mechs like the Locust or like the Piranha that can simply close the distance fast enough to where this is no longer a viable option. With all that being said, however, obviously the most reliable way to not take damage from the enemy is to not be in a position where they can physically shoot you, and staying out of range is one of the best ways to guarantee that. So in situations where surviving is absolutely critical, this is obviously the strongest part of the survivability onion to stay in, but as we'll see with a lot of this onion, it's very much a risk versus reward situation. Sometimes you have to take risks and get shot at to get good payoffs. The next layer of the survivability onion is don't be acquired, and in Battletech this could most easily be translated to simply staying outside of line of sight even if you are within weapon range. Now, the downsides and upsides of staying outside of line of sight are very similar to staying outside of range in that, generally speaking, while the enemy can't hurt you, you also often can't hurt them outside of some specific weapons. With that being said, it does often simply prove to be a more viable tactic rather than simply staying out of range, because it's a lot more consistent against the vast majority of mechs you'll fight against, as it is fairly common to see long-range weapons, but it's a lot less common to see weapons that can hit you outside of line of sight. That being said, enemies can still use things like spotters for certain types of missiles to try and acquire you anyway if even one of their mechs can see you, but if you can find positions that are outside of LOS of the entire enemy lance, then you're generally in a pretty good spot. Obviously, for the vast majority of mechs in the vast majority of cases, this is essentially going to be like the staying outside of range strategy in that it is effectively board state neutral. You're not gaining anything, but you're also not losing anything either. Both of these I would broadly refer to as holding patterns, and they're good places to put a mech in if it doesn't have anything better to do. And this also brings up an interesting aspect of both Battletech and a lot of electronic games in that sometimes there's nothing wrong with nothing. That is to say, sometimes the worst thing you can do is try to force a situation when you really don't need to. So staying in this holding pattern and preserving your mech's health while you're trying to set up a much better shot or a much better position can certainly be a viable tactic in many situations. This also leads to the interesting aspect in that a board state neutral position is actually fine if you are currently winning the board state. So if you are in a more competitive setting in something like a tournament, the top two parts of the survivability onion become far more viable if you have obtained an early lead in that scenario. However, obviously for casual games, this is kind of boring for both players if you just spend the whole game hiding and running away. The next part of the survivability onion translates the most directly to Battletech, and that is the don't be hit. And obviously there are several ways you can try to avoid being hit in Battletech that don't simply involve avoiding line of sight or avoiding range. There are numerous ways you can stack defensive buffs, but the most common one obviously being moving, in which case you will get a nice movement modifier, especially if your mech is particularly fast, something like a Piranha, an Incubus, etc., or if you have pretty good jump jets like a Mongrel. Additionally, stacking these high modifiers with things like forests or things like low hills that can cover your legs is actually a really good strategy to steadily make those to hit rolls become even more untenable, especially if you can range control enemies that have shorter range weapons. Getting a +3 modifier for a jump, a +1 for some light cover, and also a +2 for medium range quickly makes your mech nigh impossible to hit, especially if the enemy had to move at all during their turn, and forcing the enemy to move is another tactic that reduces the likelihood that you will get hit. With all that being said, this part of the survivability onion runs afoul of basically RNGesus because it turns out anybody can just roll boxcars followed by boxcars, and now your mech that was nigh unhittable is on the ground and unconscious. That being said, you can't simply let unlikely results skew your thinking on something. If a shot was very unlikely, you simply have to brush it off when it happens. There's really nothing you can do about that because this is Battletech and sometimes the dice just have their own concept of how the game should go. For a lot of light mechs in Battletech, things like the Locust and the Piranha being at the forefront, this is essentially where the survivability onion ends, as the other two layers are not really all that applicable. Any good hit to those mechs is probably going to cripple or kill them. So when using these light mechs, you should always be stacking modifiers or avoiding shots entirely where at all possible. The next layer of the survivability onion is don't be penetrated, which comfortably translates to don't have your armor be broken and get to internal structure. This is one of the first aspects that you as a player don't have a ton of direct input on because your mech's armor is what it is. You can't exactly increase armor at a moment's notice, but there are some small measures you can take to try and mitigate damage. Using things like low cover to deflect leg hits can prevent you from taking a bunch of damage, which also can reduce the piloting checks you might need, which is always a good thing to have. Additionally, you can run into scenarios where it's actually optimal to turn your back to the enemy because your front armor is virtually depleted, and obviously while it is kind of situational, you can sometimes turn the right or left armor to an opponent when the other side is basically gone. These are of course quite situational, as most mechs have both their best weapons and their best armor concentrated in the frontal arc, so 9 times out of 10 that is where you want to be shot, but it can be useful to recognize situations where you actually don't want to be hit there. A mech that obviously just lives in this part of the survivability onion would be a mech like the Stone Rhino that can take a double tap from an AC-20 straight to the chest and still not be on internal structure. The last layer is obviously just straight up don't be killed, and this translates into Battletech as having good critical locations and or enough internal structure that you can take hits even after your armor has been depleted. Obviously, much like the aspect where you don't lose armor, this is the kind of thing that you as a player don't have the most control over, but you can look for mechs that specifically have internal layouts that are a lot more resistant to getting taken out. An example of a mech that is fairly poor in this type of situation is the Battle Cobra. The Battle Cobra has no hit locations in the left or right torso, and the only hit location it has in a leg that isn't a critical component is the double heatsink in the right leg. So basically, any critical hit to the leg or left or right torso is probably going to cause you some pretty significant issues, even though it won't necessarily cause something like an ammunition explosion. Things like heat sinks and weapons that don't take up an exceptional amount of space like an Ultra AC-20 and also don't explode can make you very resilient to critical hits. Obviously, not having ammunition can also make you resilient to critical hits, but by default clan mechs do just come with a case stock, and a case will prevent you from losing the entire mech, albeit you will still lose that part of the mech and you will still need some piloting checks. Lack of ammunition can also make you resistant to heat buildup, whether it be intentional heat buildup to fire weapons and move, or unintentional heat buildup such as taking engine crits or having enemies fire weapons at you that do increase your heat. Due to the somewhat random nature of critical hits and of course the random nature of hit locations, this is probably the hardest aspect of a mech to get consistent in terms of the survivability onion, but there are aspects of mechs that can help or hinder it. At the end of the day, the survivability onion is all about risk reward. The higher you are on that onion, the less likely you are to take damage. However, the less likely you are to impact the battlefield as well, so it's important to always weigh both of those factors. Sitting in a corner doing nothing with your 100-ton mech is probably not the best idea in the world, and it is just going to have to soak some fire. Pretty much all strategies that go into the survivability onion involve an element of random chance. If your strategy is to not be hit, that random chance is obviously pretty obvious. It's the enemy's dice roll to hit you. A Piranha taking a PPC really just has to never get touched by that PPC, and a single high roll can easily be the end of that Piranha's game. That being said, when you have absolutely massive meat shields like a Stone Rhino or an Atlas, their survivability ends up being almost entirely random as well, as chewing through all of their hit points is pretty inviable unless the entire enemy squad is focusing fire on them. That means for mechs on the high end of the size and health category, you can easily be looking at scenarios where you drop force round to a few bad locations, criticals, or piloting checks, or you can just soak damage indefinitely as the enemy spreads the love around and doesn't get any good crits or headshots. At the end of the day, it is still Battletech, Battletech, and a single Gauss rifle rolling boxcars followed by boxcars is going to ruin your day no matter how many cautious steps you take. My personal experience with mechs in the survivability onion says that you should probably have a mech that has a combination of different options. Mechs that are locked into one option are very vulnerable to specific things. A Piranha, for example, is very vulnerable to enemies that just have good modifiers on their to hit roll, such as pulse lasers targeting computers, etc., or enemies that just roll enough shots that they're likely to get at least one or two through. Conversely, big heavy mechs can't really dodge anything, so they're exceptionally vulnerable to just taking big hits and hoping the enemy doesn't get good damage locations. On top of that, just eating damage can often lead to a bunch of piloting checks, and those piloting checks are eventually going to fall through no matter how good you are at them. But if you were to pan the camera over to something like, say, a Vapor Eagle that has good mobility, has a fair amount of hit points, so much so that it can generally take a Gauss rifle without being too bothered by it, and also has case for when its ammo does get hit so that it can simply shrug off the hit, the Vapor Eagle often ends up being much harder to deal with than a mech that simply has a ton of hit points or has a very high modifier to hit. And that concludes our video. Hope you enjoyed it, hope you had fun. If you did, please leave a like and subscribe, that always helps out the channel. As always, danke bitte, tschüss.